If you follow American politics, you often hear of the rural-urban divide. Why is this so meaningful and substantial? What exactly is unique about American cities that only a small fraction are Republican? To help us understand how the politics and policies of America's cities are different, I am pleased to welcome Professor Christina Greer from Fordham University in New York City. Dr. Greer specializes in American politics, Black ethnic politics, urban politics, quantitative methods, and public opinion. Dr. Greer is the author of How to Build a Democracy, from Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan to Stacey Abrams. She is also the author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, and she also hosts a podcast, FAQ NYC. Christina, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
How might politics and policy in large cities differ from smaller communities?
As Tip O'Neill reminds us that all politics is local, and we know that in cities, we're sort of pushed together. And so when we think about politics and policy, I always have to break it down on a municipal level, a state level, and a federal level, because depending on where your city is, you may be a city that has most cities are governed by Democrats, big D Democrats. You may be in a state that has a Democratic legislature in the state house. So how you get your money and how budgets are drawn looks very differently than if you're in a state that has a Republican-controlled state house. And they may be less willing to provide funds for the things that cities need. And then obviously we have federal government conversations. Even in a place like New York, everyone's like, oh, New York is super blue. New York's not super blue. Okay. No state is super blue. All states are red states. You just have blue cities in your red state, and whether or not that changes a state every 4 years in a presidential election. But, we have this idea that, it's New York City that drains the state. It's the New Yorkers in the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island that are a drag on the rest of the state, when in reality, our tax base is actually what holds up the state. So in a lot of ways, cities are what allows states to actually function in a lot of ways, even though they're sort of always going to reprimanded for being a drain. And so I think a certain type of person tends to flock to a city, right? Immigrants have always flocked to cities. Black people, by and large, live in cities. I'm a birder. So just like birds, you flock to sort of where they tend to be welcoming places. Not all, but, they tend to be places where people can find jobs, find community, and people who don't mind living in close quarters next to others who do not look like them or possibly have the same attitudes or skin color as them. People in rural areas tend to be vestiges of, either agricultural communities or people who just don't like living on top of one another. And listen, as a New Yorker, I get it. Sometimes it is hard living with 8.5 million other people. But you have a little bit more control, it feels, as to who you see and how you see things. Much more of a driving culture. It's much more of a housing culture as opposed to apartments. And so when we think about politics and policy, in many ways, cities are constantly balancing a myriad of diverse policy needs, wants, and demands. And that's not to say that rural communities don't, but there's so many more people in one particular small area as opposed to a rural community where there's a lot of geographic space, but not necessarily a lot of people.
Your research sits at the intersection of the Black population, urban politics. Before I get into some specifics, what sparked your interest in this topic?
So my first book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, I realized when we were talking about Black people, I'm like, well, what kind of Black people? If you travel and, you live in cities, you recognize that, like, the Black person next to you might be from Trinidad, first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, or Ghana, second generation, or, they could be, Bahamian like me, but it's like, but it was so long ago for, one grandparent from a state that I've never lived in. So I see myself as Black American and not necessarily Bahamian. So this idea of race and ethnicity was fascinating to me because, police officers don't care if you're, Ghanaian, if they're going to pull you over. It's not like, oh, well, you're different than the other Blacks. They don't care that you're Jamaican or Haitian. When certain interactions happen. And so when we think about the defunding of education in cities and how Black people tend to be racially segregated and live with one another, how these tensions can arise because phenotypically we may be similar, but there may be some distinctions in policy. So I was really curious as to where do we agree and differ on particular policy issues so we can find some sort of commonality and build some substantial coalitions and get more as a larger group. And so that's, and now that Blacks in America are the third largest racial and ethnic group, as opposed to the second, which Blacks were, say, 20 years ago. And it looks like if trends continue, Blacks will soon be the fourth largest group as Asian Americans continue to increase in population size.
It's so interesting that you talk about the differences in the Black community, and this is something as a kid I didn't appreciate. I didn't really have any perspective on it, but I was in DC a couple of weeks ago, and I can always count on finding a nice Ethiopian restaurant.
Absolutely.
And you don't necessarily get that in Mississippi or in Texas where I grew up, but if you go to DC or New York, you can find those different Black and certainly Caribbean as well that are going to be more pronounced in urban areas. So what are the electoral consequences of Black urban concentration? Given that Blacks are in cities, how does that then affect the politics for Blacks with this concentration, whereas, say, the white population is urban as well, but also far more rural?
One, there are just more white people in this country, period. Two, there's sort of a packing that occurs. So if Black people are predominantly in cities, then they're sort of packed into these districts in a lot of ways. And we're sort of seeing this with conversations about gerrymandering and whether it's racial or whether it's partisan gerrymandering. And so there are pros and cons, right? When you have a large group of people in one particular area, you could possibly get more, right? If the people are on the same page and they sort of have similar policy leanings. Or you could have so many people packed in one place, those who don't live in said place get nothing. And so that's some of the concern. Now, it is interesting, our colleague Lorrie Frasure, her first book was on Blacks in the suburbs, because I think a lot of times we talk about cities and rural, and we forget this very important third group that's kind of in the middle, which are suburbans. And we're seeing more and more Blacks and Latinos move to the suburbs and change that composition. Now, oftentimes suburbs can be sort of encapsulated in, sort of our ideas of cities when we think about, say, congressional representation. However, when we're thinking about municipal representation, that's very different in how Black folks are getting elected and participating in electoral politics in suburban spaces. To me, is fascinating because it's no longer Black people are in cities and then we have sort of some vestiges of rural communities and Blacks largely in the South. Now we're seeing Blacks in suburbs across the country and still in cities. And we still always have these vestiges of Black rural populations in the South. So it's kind of a Neapolitan ice cream as opposed to just one or a dichotomous relationship.
I love that. So instead of Bluebell's Great Divide, where you've got chocolate and vanilla, the Neapolitan, it's all blended together.
Yeah,
I love
because
this.
it's a little fluid, and so we see a lot of folks moving from cities to suburbs, whether it's because of the quest for home ownership or better schools, or at least the perception of better schools, or safety, or at least the perception of safety, or job prospects. And so I do think that having this conversation about cities, of which, Black people are still predominantly in cities, but we're seeing a rapid kind of out-migration, and some of it is voluntary, but some of it is economic. I mean, we're seeing the Black population decrease in New York City exponentially every single census because it is so difficult to rent or own in this city. And we're grappling with deed theft right now. So Black families that had bought in neighborhoods that were predominantly Black and their tax rates were a certain way, we're now seeing, because of higher tax rates, Black folks losing their family homes, or a story of grandma dies but doesn't have a will, and so that turns things into a disarray. Or what we're really seeing is a lot of predatory reverse mortgage deed theft that is just blatant. It's really affected a lot of Black New Yorkers, so much so that our population has decreased. I think it's like almost 20% in the past 20 years. I mean, something really astronomical. And then you add in COVID, and here we are.
Well, in my neck of the woods in Austin, Texas, where that city's become very expensive. East Austin, home to Houston-Tillotson, a historically Black college. The community used to be 100% Black, and now very few Blacks live there. They have been priced out and pushed out. Personally, I'm not familiar with this phrase, deed theft. It sounds like it's a problem in New York.
It is, and it's affecting full Black communities, not just individual families here and there.
In the immediate aftermath of Louisiana versus Calais, several GOP legislatures moved to immediately reduce the number of Black-held congressional districts. Did this response surprise you?
No, Republicans are constantly signaling what they're going to do. They've been saying that they wanted to do this for years. It's just Democrats, when it happens, they're like, oh my gosh, clutch my pearls. This happened. Yes, they told you it was going to happen, guys. Like, look alive. So this is, we know that Republican policies are by and large not popular, so they have to change the mechanisms by which they can stay in office, because it's not going to be because of policy, so it has to be redistricting or rampant, I would argue, racist gerrymandering. I do try and think of ways where it could possibly benefit Black people. There are some stronghold Republican districts that were, say, 59 are. Now that before Blacks were packed into one district. If you think about South Carolina, all the Black cities are just encapsulated in one Black district going straight down the state. So you've had Black/Democratic voters packed into one district. Now that you've cracked them open, we've said that these districts are Republican districts, but now that you have new voters, that doesn't necessarily mean that 59 stays at a 59. That could be a 51 or 50 if you have a good candidate, right? So, there are ways that Democrats might actually have a fighting chance in some of these districts where, given the right candidate and a right policy position, they could be ripe for the picking. Or Republicans being so upset by promises not kept by this particular administration and the Republican sycophants that follow along, that they may abstain from voting. They wouldn't necessarily vote for a Democrat, but they would abstain from voting, which then does give Democrats a better chance, if they have a message, to pick up a possible seat here or there that's not expected because of policies and new voters in the district. Now, that's like a best case scenario dealing with the cards that we have. But I think the frustrating piece for those of us who study partisan politics is that, Republicans very rarely do things sort of in the cloak of night and on a whim. They've been planning for 60, 50, 40 years, whatever it may be, and they signal what they're going to do every single time. It's just the Democrats consistently get caught flat-footed, and we're left scratching our heads. How? How are you left unaware when they told you what they were going to do time and time again?
It seems that in the 13 years since Shelby County versus Holder, that this moment was, to me, inevitable. That once Chief Justice John Roberts essentially eviscerated the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, that this moment was inevitable. And, so this is just me sitting on the neutral objective observer. And to your point, you're saying that the Democratic Party has had more than a decade to prepare itself for this moment.
Right.
And it seems the response is, well, we'll sue. We'll just try to sue, but you
with
can't.
What courts? The Democrats they weren't concerned with stacking courts the way Republicans are. You know what I'm saying? So you'll sue, but it's like the Republicans are like, oh, we're already on that. For the past 30 years, and definitely for the past 10, we've been stacking the courts at every single level with folks who are ideologues. And they're young, and many of them are unqualified, but they are partisan, Republicans, and they don't care. Or they are qualified in the sense that they've gone through, we both like sports. Baseball, it's like they've gone through the farm team, right? They're part of the Federalist Society. There's money invested in them. They have been hand-selected since college and law school and when they were, young lawyers, and they have gone through the system, and they are now judges in every single layer of the judicial system in all 50 states. Democrats have seen this time and time again, clutching pearls. We'll sue them. It's like, in whose court, sweetheart? You will miss the boat. Republicans have now stacked the courts or prevented you from filling up seats. And you just said, well, we'll do it next time, and never rang the alarm. So here we are.
I'm planning on having some guests in the future talk about Coke Industries and their ability to fund the interest group think tank network that has supplied Federalist Society judges and these interest groups that create this, I'm trying to think of the best phrase for it.
Ecosystem.
Yes, that has supplied everything that you've just described. So I have two questions left for you. As a reminder, today I'm joined by Professor Christina Greer of Fordham University. By reducing Black urban political representation through this gerrymandering that we've talked about, the takeaways, this fundamentally reduces all Black political representation because there's very little Black rural political representation. What's the long-term strategy for Blacks in particular, whether it's through the Republican Party or most likely through the Democratic Party, to kind of arrest this? Is it just through the Democratic Party? Is there something that Blacks can do independently?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big quandary, right? Because the Republican Party has largely cast their lot with white supremacy. So that's not really a welcoming party for a lot of Black people because of the blatant racism that many Republican candidates and electeds are happy sort of stomaching or espouting themselves. And then the Democratic Party, many Black people are just sort of like, this is, party capture, as we talk about in political science. But we're seeing, not just with Black people, but across the country, an increasing number of folks who want to identify as independents because they're dissatisfied with both parties. And their parties aren't mentioned in the Constitution. We just sort of settle in this dichotomous two-party system until a third party either gets subsumed by one of the parties or it gets big enough and it subsumes one of the dominant parties. And so we have Black folks who are more increasingly becoming independents, even though all the literature shows that even the Black women are the most faithful Democratic voters and keepers of democracy. The second most faithful group are Black men, period. And so obviously that's not the narrative, but like Black men and Black women support the Democratic Party in high 80%, low 90%. Everybody else, you get to Asians and Latinos, they're in the 60s and the 50s. Whites are in the 30s, and that's including white women. Even though the narrative is that Black men are leaving the party, they're not leaving the party the way other groups have already left the party. I do think that this idea of being independent is a little complicated when you take a state like New York, where we have closed primaries. So some states have closed primaries where all the action happens in, say, June or May or April, whenever you have your election. That's when you really select kind of the candidate. Because, for us, election day is June 23rd. Whoever wins June 23rd, realistically, is winning on November 3rd, right? In some races, you don't even have a Republican challenger. So to be an independent, you take yourself out of the selection process. And so I understand why people would, be disillusioned and dissatisfied with the party system. Whenever people move to New York, I tell them, I'm like, I don't care what your political leanings are. You need to register, depending on what part of the city you live in. But let's just say you live on the Upper West Side where, Fordham is located, where I lived for 20 years. I'm like, I don't care what you identify as. You must register as a Democrat. If so, you can't participate in anything. Oftentimes, there's not even a Republican on the ballot. So if you're conservative, you might as well register as a Democrat so you can participate and choose the most conservative of the Democrats to get something as opposed to nothing. And so I do think that as we continue to have closed party systems, which obviously benefits electeds, right? Some of these choices that we would need to make that would increase participation would actually decrease people's chances of reelection. So we're not seeing that. We started ranked choice voting, which has broadened the electorate in a lot of ways and given people choices, at least in New York for the last two elections. It yielded results that a lot of people are not happy with, right? Eric Adams was the first candidate to win ranked choice voting when we implemented it. Many people were not happy about Eric Adams. Zohran Mamdani, ranked choice voting, second round. It was a wrap, right? Of course, a lot of people don't even participate in primaries. I think that there's like a civics voter education that needs to happen, and a lot of people don't even bother to participate in municipal elections, primaries, or races other than, in November when you're voting in a presidential election year. And as we've seen, one, there's a pipeline that you sort of mentioned, like these people who kind of go through a system, not just in the courts, but electorally. And there's some people, it's like, if you don't stop them at the pass, you can look up and they're your senator. And they're there with the incumbency advantage for quite some time.
We certainly see that in the South, and I had never realized until this conversation the parallels. I teach a politics of the American South class, and much of that is party change, how the South went from Democrat to Republican. But I spend a lot of time talking about when the South was a one-party state, and you just drew a lot of parallels to what you can see in New York City right now, where if you're not involved in the Democratic side, you're not involved at all.
Right.
And
And I mean, we have Republicans. Don't get me wrong. We got
sure,
Republicans. Of our 51 member city council, we have 5 Republicans. And, Staten Island, largely
right.
represented. So there's so many parts of the city where it's like, it just behooves you to register as a Democrat, even if you're not, because you won't be able to participate if you're not.
You talked about how Black men and Black women are the strength of the Democratic Party. And of course, in your book, How to Build a Democracy, where you talk about Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan and Stacey Abrams, which to me, I immediately think of women like that as the backbone.
And I chose them because they're Southern Black women. Like, there's something about being a Black American woman from the U.S. South. And this is not to disrespect Shirley Chisholm, New Yorker, Guyanese descent. But I think that there's something specific about Fannie Lou Hamer and her outsider politics and Barbara Jordan and her insider politics from the state of Texas, producing 50 years later someone like Stacey Abrams, who's a hybrid of those two in the state of Georgia.
I find that all three of them are not only the structural foundation of the Democratic Party, but I think you could argue the moral foundation of the Democratic Party. They are the Democratic Party at its best instincts, but for a variety of reasons, their political ceiling was limited. You mentioned Lorrie Fraser's book, Blacks in the Suburbs. And besides your own books, do you have recommendations for people who want to learn more about the things that we've talked about today, books, articles, authors that you kind of go to for learning?
Well, my go-to article that I teach every single semester, no matter what class, except for my intro class, because we have to kind of get through foundations, but any upper level political science class, I teach Jesse Jackson's 1969 interview in Playboy magazine. It's a fantastic understanding of class and moral failings of the nation when it comes to poverty as economic violence against Black people and others. To think that we had someone right after the assassination of King who was so laser focused on trying to keep the King coalition going, which is, it is not just about racism, of which that is a foundation of this nation, but white people, I need you to understand that you too are being oppressed by the economic violence that is inflicted upon you. And so you're choosing skin color over your own circumstance. And you don't need to do that. And so he lays it out so brilliantly. And also our involvement in various warlike interventions across the globe, which sadly have far too many parallels and similarities to today. So even though it's a 1969 article, it feels like Jesse Jackson could have said it yesterday. So that's that. That's my go-to always. And, I read a lot of fiction, just, whatever is kind of the latest Black female fiction novels. Tyree Jones, a great new book out called Kin. And, but I always go to Mark Twain. He helps me understand America at its best, largely because he was always, his money was a little funny. So the way he wrote was to make sure that if you were a staunch racist or segregationist, you liked his books, but if you were abolitionist, you liked his books. And so it's a really phenomenal kind of hologram of America. And you can see it from whatever angle you're looking at. It makes sense. The prism is just written so brilliantly. And my favorite is Pudd'nhead Wilson. And again, it sort of lays out whiteness and Blackness in the country of a particular time. But again, because we are ahistoric, we just don't seem to pick up on some of the lessons from the turn of the century, a century ago.
I love all these recommendations. And if anything, you have given a great validation of power of the liberal arts as an education, how you take these different strands and bring them together to help understand our political history. Also, so many parallels today that we see.
Well, what is it, E.B. White? They always say it's different people who the quote is attributed to, but it says, "We read to know we're not alone." And I think that to me, so many students now aren't really into reading and, they kind of come to class based on feelings. And, folks outside of college don't read the way they used to, but we can find the answers in literature. We can find the answers in poetry. We can find the answers in the books and articles that we write. So that's, I constantly am trying to read so I can put all these crazy puzzle pieces together called America.
I'm right there with you. Everybody go off and read a book and read some of these. I'll put links to everything that you've mentioned in the show notes. Professor Christina Greer, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Go Knicks!